On May 20th, 2022, the foreign ministers of both of Ukraine's breakaway republics, neither of which would actually exist without extensive support from the Russian military, met with a North Korean diplomat, the North Korean ambassador to Moscow actually, with the hopes of establishing full diplomatic relations. This followed claims by both foreign ministers that widespread international recognition of the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic is just around the corner. In April, the Luhansk foreign minister, Vladislav Deinego, told the media he was currently discussing the, quote, establishment of diplomatic relations with 10 different countries with a view to getting economic cooperation and recognition. And his Donetsk counterpart, Natalya Nikonorova, recently told leading Russian newspaper Kommersant that she was in negotiations with several countries and that there would be news very soon. If the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic were about to achieve widespread international recognition, that would be a huge deal and would go a long way to legitimizing Russia's occupation of eastern Ukraine. So will this happen? No, not a chance. Because you see, foreign ministers Deinego and Nikonorova are professional liars. You can't believe anything that they say. And also, by the way, they're both wanted criminals. So let's talk about these two diplomatic pretenders. Who are they, and what do they do all day? Stay tuned. Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and I have long been fascinated by the pseudo-diplomacy which surrounds the various breakaway republics which Russia has propped up in former bits of the Soviet Union over the years. I even made an entire video about the utterly bizarre diplomatic relations between one of them, Abkhazia, and the tiny Pacific island nation of Nauru. But the diplomacy of the Luhansk People's Republic, or LPR, and the Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, is arguably much more bizarre and definitely much more pathetic than anything that Abkhazia has ever done. But just in case anyone isn't totally clear on what the LPR and DPR are, here's a quick update. The first few months of 2014 was a turbulent time in Ukraine. A series of enormous protests erupted in Kyiv, which eventually brought down the pro-Russia government, which was then in power. This event is known as the Maidan Revolution, and the downfall of the pro-Russian government in Kyiv sparked unrest in an eastern region of Ukraine known as the Donbass, where pro-Russian political parties used to enjoy widespread support. President Vladimir Putin of Russia decided to take advantage of the unrest in the Donbass and sent unmarked Russian military units across the border into Ukraine that April. Under Russian protection, self-appointed groups of pro-Russian locals in Donetsk and Luhansk held illegal and very rushed independence referendums, which they won, and then, with the help of Russian soldiers, the pro-Russian activists carved out two small bits of Ukraine, which they called the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. These two mini-states claim to represent the interests of an oppressed minority which is seeking self-determination. But in reality, they only exist to add a veneer of legitimacy to Russia's occupation. Russia claims that it is only trying to help local people defend themselves. And that, adding a veneer of legitimacy to Russia's occupation, is also the main task of these two, Vladislav Deinego and Natalya Nikonorova. They spend their days desperately trying to make themselves look like real diplomats, and their respective people's republics like real countries. They pose for photos, exchange knickknacks with other fake diplomats, and issue press releases, which hardly anyone reads. What's particularly pathetic about this is even though all this sound and fury is in theory done in the interests of Russia, the Russian establishment clearly doesn't take the LPR or DPR at all seriously, and it can't even be bothered to go through the motions of treating either like a serious government. For example, between 2014 and 2022, Russia just never got around to recognizing either as a legitimate country. But when Putin decided he wanted to invade Ukraine again earlier this year, he suddenly realized it would be helpful if these two fake countries suddenly seemed more legitimate. So he ordered the Russian legislature, the Duma, to recognize them. And then he strong-armed Abkhazia, another breakaway republic in Russia's orbit, to do the same. Delighted to finally be given a shred of legitimacy, the LPR and DPR quickly appointed ambassadors to Moscow with great fanfare. But very tellingly, 3 months on, Putin has yet to even nominate ambassadors from his side. There have been no orders yet, a spokesperson explained on the 17th of May. So yeah, pathetic. The LPR and DPR in reality are just little quisling pseudo-states, desperate for attention and approval from Big Daddy Russia, which they never quite get. Speaking of quislings, let's talk about these two foreign ministers. It might seem like neither of these two are especially serious figures, but I should point out that the Ukrainian government considers them both to be wanted criminals, and considers the fake governments they represent to be terrorist organizations. I think that's an entirely reasonable position for the Ukrainian government to take. These two have done their best to justify the killing of tens of thousands of their fellow Ukrainians. Of the two, there's less information available about Vladislav Deinego, partly because he appears to be the more boring of the two, and partly because the foreign ministry doesn't have a website. And actually, both of these governments have really struggled just to keep a website online for more than a year or two since they were created. It's really weird. But honestly, if you can't remember to make your annual domain registry payments, that's a pretty pathetic attempt at public administration. When the LPR declared itself independent in 2014, Deinego, who was then serving as a local government official, was appointed to the People's Council, the LPR's rubber-stamp legislature. Later that year, he was appointed as the LPR's representative to the peace negotiations, which used to take place between Ukraine and Russia in Minsk. It's during the Minsk negotiations that the LPR and DPR have arguably been most useful to Russia. By claiming to represent homegrown separatist movements, they help Russia claim that its military is in Ukraine just to help protect two persecuted peoples who are seeking self-determination. This argument was thoroughly undermined, and Foreign Minister Deinego was thoroughly discredited at one Minsk negotiating session in 2016. During the talks, the Ukrainian representative, Alexei Reznikov, held up photocopies of a passport which had been issued to Deinego, a Russian passport. So, in other words, while Russia was claiming that the conflict in the Donbass was just an internal conflict between the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian separatists, not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it turned out that one of the most prominent of these so-called separatists is actually a Russian citizen, and therefore not an independent actor at all. So that's a bad look. Okay, so he might lack credibility on the international stage. But how about back home? Surely Foreign Minister Deinego gets lots of respect on the streets of Luhansk. No. Here's a video which surfaced a few days ago showing a group of women berating Deinego in public. These women are wives of soldiers who are fighting in the war. The women shout, "Return our husbands, the 206th Regiment, many killed, wounded, and captured." Deinego looks really uncomfortable here and obviously has no idea what to do. Eventually he starts becoming really interested in his phone, but the women keep up their insistent questions. Eventually he advises these desperately upset people to get the information they seek by sending, quote, "a written application to the Military Registration and Enlistment Office." It's hard to imagine a real foreign minister like Antony Blinken or Annalena Baerbock being harangued by an ordinary group of citizens on the street like this. But if it did happen, I'm confident that they would have something a good deal less lame to say. Honestly, these women are terrified they'll never see their husbands again and are getting no information from their so-called governments. Can't you even express a little bit of sympathy, Vladislav? Now there's much more information available about DPR Foreign Minister Natalya Nikonorova. She's been in office since 2016, and fair or not, when she was appointed, a lot of critics questioned her fitness for office. Nikonorova does have a law degree, and she had worked as a staff member for various Ukrainian elected officials for 6 years before the conflict in the Donbass began. I'm going to take the high road here. I'm going to offer what I think is a plausible explanation for this very unlikely appointment. Good old-fashioned nepotism. Nikonorova's father, brother, and mother, all seen here, are members of the DPR nomenclatura elite. Her father is the head of the DPR Department of Industry, and although he keeps a much lower profile than his daughter, is possibly one of the most powerful men in the DPR establishment. And also, let's remember, her job is not at all challenging, so it doesn't really matter if she's qualified to be a foreign minister or not. There's no real diplomacy to manage or complex negotiations to conduct. I don't think Nikonorova or Deinego have any real influence, or that their opinions carry any real weight. Their jobs are just to take whatever scraps the Russian foreign ministry gives them, pose for photographs, and issue press releases claiming huge wins. And that's exactly what this recent meeting in Moscow with the North Korean ambassador was, a photo op with no real meaning. And it probably only took place after a great deal of pressure was put on the North Korean ambassador. Because you see, the LPR and DPR even to a country like North Korea, are, well, toxic. No government with any shred of self-respect wants to have any association with either of them. They embody Putin's violation of the post-World War II international consensus. And if you look closely at the reported details of this North Korean meeting, it was obviously a giant nothing burger. In this press release from the DPR Foreign Ministry website, all it says is that they discussed having more meetings, maybe, and the LPR and DPR expressed gratitude for the chance to meet. Of course they did. Hardly anyone else will meet with them. I mean, from what I've been able to find, even Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, will not pose for a photograph with either of these two. But even though Russia's foreign minister seems to be avoiding them, Russia has recently strong-armed Abkhazia, a breakaway republic in Georgia, which is also propped up by a Russian military presence, into recognizing the LPR and DPR. South Ossetia, the other breakaway republic inside Georgia, recognized the two people's republics back in 2014, but as I'll show you in a moment, South Ossetia would recognize a ham sandwich if given half a chance. But despite South Ossetia's lead, Abkhazia held out on recognizing the LPR and DPR for another 8 years. And notably, the two other breakaway republics which the Russian military supports, Artsakh and Transnistria, still have not recognized them. So you know your fake country is seriously a Billy No-Mates when most of Russia's other fake countries won't even acknowledge you. But despite being snubbed by both Artsakh and Transnistria, Deinego and Nikonorova have both told the Russian media with straight faces that recognition from lots of countries is coming soon, which is preposterous. Besides their toxicity, there's another reason that diplomats are steering clear of DPR and LPR photo ops. There's no reason to believe that either country will last much longer, as both the LPR and DPR could be annexed and wound up by Russia at any moment. That would be a violation of international law, of course, but, you know, Russia. 2 months ago, LPR President Leonid Pesechnik announced that a referendum on joining Russia would be held, quote, in the near future, while the DPR's ambassador to Moscow, Olga Makieva, was just last week quoted in a Russian state publication saying that there would be a referendum on joining Russia as soon as there was peace. So whatever the result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the days of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic seem to be numbered, which makes any discussion of international recognition with another country really unappealing. But while we wait to see what will happen to these two fake countries, there's nothing for these two foreign ministers to do but continue to pose for photographs with the few people willing to meet with them in public, like the outgoing foreign minister of South Ossetia, Dmitry Medvedev. Of course, there's one international relationship that's very obvious for the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics to pursue, which they very tellingly are not: integration with each other. Both the LPR and DPR are tiny, and both have the same objectives and guiding philosophies. Wouldn't these two mini-states be much more viable if they merged? You'd think so, but from what I can tell, Moscow really doesn't want this to happen. And they've already put the brakes on a previous attempt to try this. You see, less than 2 weeks after the LPR and DPR held their independence referendums, they suddenly renounced their independence in favor of a new federal state of Novorossiya, using this flag. Yeah, I know. Okay, so let's untangle a few things here. Novorossiya literally means New Russia, but it's not a new name. It's a centuries-old name that no one's used for a very long time. It'd be like referring to the southwest of England, where I live, as Wessex.
We fight for Wessex!
That wouldn't be technically wrong, I guess. It would be weird, but not technically wrong. Also, this flag looks very much like the Confederate flag used in the American Civil War and which continues to be used by white supremacists all around the world. But even though I do suspect that the ultranationalists which were behind Novorossiya sort of like the association with racism, this blue saltire on a red background is actually an old historic Russian flag, and it does appear in the old Russian imperial arms in very small form, right here. So they announced this new thing, Novorossiya. It was immediately recognized by South Ossetia, of course, but no one else. They formed yet another new parliament, a federal parliament, which our friend Vladislav Deinego was a member of, and they combined their armed forces into a united Novorossian military, and published some really cringe YouTube videos. But then that united Novorossian army shot down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 as it flew over territory it controlled with a surface-to-air missile, killing 298 people and shocking the world. The Kremlin swooped in and removed key leaders from both republics, and within a year of its announcement, the dream of a united Novorossiya was on hold, where it's been ever since. The Russian authorities have not been at all transparent about what has happened to Novorossiya, but I suspect that they really want the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics to remain weak and divided, and therefore much easier to control. One last thing. I really did my best to contact Vladislav Deinego and Natalya Nikonorova to get their side of the story for this video. I emailed them, I sent messages to their Facebook pages, I even tried contacting them on Telegram, and I never got a response. Actually, I did find one guy on Telegram named Vladislav Deinego who did respond to me, but his response was to in Russian. So I don't think that was actually him. I found at least 3 people in the world with that name, so it probably wasn't him. But anyway, I never got a response. So Natalya and Vladislav, if you found this video really one-sided, it wasn't for a lack of trying on my part. If you want to try and set the record straight, get in touch with me. You might not like what I have to say, but unlike Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov, I will at least talk to you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And also let me know in the comments what you think about all this pseudo-diplomacy. And what do you think is going to happen to the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics? Will they eventually be annexed by Russia, or will Ukraine eventually drive the Russian military presence out? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. And I'll see you guys in the next video.